surface, where I learned to face my fears and go with the flow. But it's when I came to appreciate the big and the small, made new friends from all over, and could no longer hide my true colors, that I knew I'd emerged a local.
Hello, my dear friends. It's been a while since your last visit, but I want you to know I'm here for you now and in better days ahead. Things may have slowed in your world, but it's anything but slow here. My reefs teem with colorful fish. Schooling hammerheads circle the deep. Playful dolphins roam the shallows. And gentle waves whisper, "Come back to me." I know you're spending hours dreaming of my underwater forest, of my soaring eagle rays, of my wise giant leatherback turtles, of my playful and friendly lions, of the stars that shine below, and the serenading humpback singing. And just as you are resetting, so am I. Everything is more vivid, more plentiful, brighter. I'll continue to surprise you more than ever before. We're always connecting, you and I. In me, you seek solace. And I promise to heal you and delight you. My creatures are calling. A new adventure is waiting. I'll see you soon.
is a gift that we have shared with the world. But in the stillness of today, our island is asking everyone to give us a moment. To be with our family, Ifamagonte, our children, our grandchildren, Itanota, our land, our thoughts, to be creative. Fanhongi, to have faith. To be with the things we know and the things you've come to love. Give us a moment, and we will share one together soon.
Butterflies are under my skin. I can feel the wings trembling. They will save me from falling. Wings are bringing me back to the land. 100 hands are around me, but they will save me from falling. See the flying so high. I would like to be with them.
Love the ocean, protect the ocean. Ocean Positive. Swimwear made from lost or abandoned fishing nets, recycled from the sea.
Two, one.
Hi, welcome everyone. Welcome back actually to Asia Dive Virtual Expo. And today, our session for today would be on the unveiling of the blue economy. And we have here today is Mr. Bruce Dudley, the Senior Vice President for the Delta Group and also Globe Series. And he will be sharing us more details about what is there to know about the blue economy and some of the findings that he has gathered from the last Globe Series session that happened in Canada. So without further ado, let me introduce you, Mr. Bruce Dudley. Bruce?
Thanks so much, Nora. Are you going to launch the slide?
Yes, please.
PowerPoint for me? It's a pleasure to be here. Pleasure to talk about our joint efforts on the Ocean Partnership Summit, which you'll see in the title of the slide, Ocean Partnership Summit Unveiling the Blue Economy. I'm joining you from beautiful Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. So probably we're at least sharing some of the same weather because things are finally starting to warm up here. So real pleasure to be here. Real pleasure to share with you some of the work that Globe Series and Underwater 360 have been doing on the Ocean Partnership Summit. So next slide, please, Nora. So a little bit of an agenda. I want to introduce the constellation, who we are, just so that you've got some familiarity. A bit of history of the Ocean Partnership Summit that was launched in Singapore in April 2019. The Blue Economy panel and the advance that we held in Vancouver in February this year. Some of the key findings from the Blue Economy advance. What does it mean for plastics and ocean health? And of course, what are the next steps for ADEX Pixel in terms of our next session that we're hoping to bring you that dives even deeper into the economic impacts associated with plastics and ocean debris. Next slide, please, Nora. So who we are, we're a constellation of organizations. We are joined by a shared vision, and that vision is to achieve a sustainable and prosperous and socially just future within a generation, and have fun while we're doing it. Next slide, Nora. So the organizations that are part of the constellation, the Globe Series, who Nora already introduced, this is our convening arm, our events arm of the organization, and our effort is to accelerate the clean economy. The consulting side, which is the Delphi group, that's where our domain knowledge exists. And then Leading Change is our young environmental professionals group, which is trying to help support them in the development of the skills they need to participate in creating that clean economy. And then lastly, we have a corporate sustainability leadership group called the Excel Partnership, which has been around, I think, for about 25 years. Next slide, please, Nora. So on the domain knowledge side, the Delphi Group consultancy is based on 4 main service areas. Clean tech and innovation, which is a lot of where the conversation is coming from that I'm going to share with you. Climate change is one of the key issues that we focus on. Corporate sustainability, which are strategies to help organizations be more sustainable. People, profit, planet. If you've heard that statement in the past. And then green economy, which also is touched upon in this presentation. That is really understanding the jobs and value creation that comes from more sustainable efforts. So next slide, please, Nora. So that's the end of the marketing piece of the presentation. So where did the Ocean Partnership Summit come from? And I remember John in Singapore, I think last April, talked a little bit about this history, but I'll go over with you again what it is because I think it's important to understand. So in 2018, Canada hosted the G7 Ocean Summit in Halifax, Canada, Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. And the Globe Series was fortunate enough to work with the federal government, our federal government, in that initiative. John Fett, our John from ADEX, was in attendance at the G7 and was introduced to my CEO, Mike Gerbis, by Minister McKenna, who was then Minister of Environment and Climate Change Canada. Minister McKenna called for a collaboration on both sides of the Pacific to address plastics and other critical ocean health issues. And she, I can just say that she is a very powerful force, Minister McKenna, and she was quite successful at convincing John and Mike to work together. So the Ocean Partnership Summit was formed in Halifax in 2018 and launched at ADEX in April 2019. Next slide, please, Nora. So, as part of the Ocean Partnership Summit, both ADEX and Underwater 360 and Globe Series agreed to conduct ocean health-related activities on both sides of the Pacific through our respective events. Now, the focus is on plastics, and that is certainly an urgent and compelling issue, but we've also delved into other aspects of ocean health in both organizations. The first major effort at Globe Globe Forum, which was our big event on the west coast of Canada in February of 2020. So very fortunate we actually had the event in February of 2020, because if we'd waited to March when it usually is held, it would not have happened because of the pandemic. So we were quite fortunate to actually have the event and have our Blue Economy panel and our advance as a component of the sustainable finance theme at Globe Forum. So the panel, which was on the Wednesday, I think it was February 12th, was constituted with the World Bank was there talking about their Blue Bonds initiative. We had Washington State there from the US who was talking about ocean project financing, as well as prioritization setting. And then we had technology and innovation represented, Open Ocean Robotics, which if we get a chance to talk a little bit more about them, we can share. That was Julie Angus, was the CEO of Open Ocean Robotics. So the panel explored a number of issues in creating scale for ocean innovation and financing. And I think why that's important to the issue of plastics and why that's important to ADEX and Asia Pacific is because this is a massive problem. I think 18 billion pounds of plastics go into our oceans every year. We are making a small dent in that through the cleanup efforts and the initiatives, both of the non-governmental community, but others who are working hard, but we're scratching the surface. There's a massive problem to solve the flow of plastics going into the ocean, but also to clean up the plastics that are there. We need scale, and scale will be an important feature that I'll touch on throughout the conversation. Next slide, please, Mark. And I'll try and go a little faster on these so that I can get to the really important stuff, which is the findings that we think are quite relevant to the work of ADEX and future work on OPS in Asia Pacific. So the Globe Advance, let me say a little bit about it. The Globe Advance was created on for the last day of the event. And it was really to try to create a situation where delegates who come to the conference could take a deeper dive into issues that we thought were important. We had 6 advances. One of them was on the blue economy. And again, as I mentioned, it was part of the sustainable finance theme. It was a 3-hour session, and I'll tell you a little bit about the process in a second. We had 35 participants who stayed over that extra day to participate, including John. And we had a strong international and domestic representation in the session. Smaller group than in the other 5 sessions, but I think that reflects the fact that blue economy as a topic, as well as ocean finance, is relatively new. So they're unlike the circular economy that I think had over 120 participants. Blue economy is newer, so it didn't attract as much attention. But for the folks that were there, highly passionate about oceans, highly passionate about the future of investment in the area. So some of the participants that were there, federal and provincial governments, state governments from the US, international financial institutions, technology financiers, they were a really important group in the dialogue. Carbon offsets, and I can say a little bit more about that if we have time. These are project financing groups. And then project developers and technology developers. The session moderators, so essentially what we did was we had an opening context setting where we had sharing of information from the panel the previous day and a whiteboard, which I'll tell you a little bit about. And then we had 3 speakers: sustainable finance, the Great Lakes experience, and I'll tell you a bit about the Great Lakes, and ocean innovation. And those 3 speakers set the tone for our 2 breakouts groups. One was on domestic, so what can we do in Canada specifically? And then the second group was the international group, which focused not exclusively on plastics, but spent a lot of time on plastics. So the remainder of this presentation is based on the advanced format. Next slide, Lauren. Thank you. So let me start with the definition, because there are a lot of different definitions of blue economy. For our advance, we needed something that included both oceans, but also inland seas and fresh water because of the domestic breakout. So that's that's where we started. But essentially, the blue economy refers to the benefits or the services that oceans provide. So essentially, if you're a fisher, your livelihood is made from extracting protein from the ocean. You're part of the blue economy. If you're in the dive tourism industry, or you're providing equipment or services to tourism through diving, you're part of the blue economy. It's anywhere that the ocean provides us services. If you're part of shipping and freight and marine vessels, you're part of the blue economy. Those are the services that the oceans and lakes and rivers provide us. And there's an economic value associated with that. But what we heard from the session was that our definition, although it worked well for the international component, it was limited in terms of freshwater ecosystems in Canada. And one of the comments we got was we need to broaden it to include not just oceans and marine environments, but also things like groundwater, drinking water treatment, rainwater, flooding, conveyance, the movement of water, wastewater management, and even bottled water was suggested on the list. So the two considerations that they thought were most important to the definition were stewardship, which is the protection of, as well as the economic activities, which we've already started to get into, and that's the promotion of sustainable development of business sectors that depend on water, like fisheries, like tourism, etc. And we'll talk more about this in a bit. Next slide, please, Nora. So we mentioned already the magnitude of the problem of plastics, 13 billion pounds. This came out of our panel where there was a lot of discussion on the need for scale for solutions. It was recognized that this isn't just an environmental problem, it's also a financial and a legal challenge that exists due to the lack of ownership of a lot of the waters that are in the ocean, are outside jurisdictional boundaries. Therefore, environmentalists, academics, scientists, people who are working on these issues need to work within these systems to find solutions. So partnerships to drive investment and response, we need a larger global response. We need that scale if we're going to be able to achieve the impacts that we need to make. And then lastly, you're going to hear me talk about definition of blue economy in a number of different perspectives, but we need a definition that captures the broadness of the blue economy, while everything from preserving and replanting seagrass and mangroves to dealing with plastics pollution and all of the regulatory processes that go along with that. Next slide, please, Nora. I know I'm throwing a lot of information at you, but we will pause for questions at the end. And this deck will be made available, so don't worry about taking notes. So observations from the conference itself. Well, we did talk about the fact that we had a panel, and some of the things they talked about was that Canada needed to continue to be a leader and set example for other nations. Canada is an interesting country because we have the longest shoreline, I believe, in the world, and we face 3 oceans. So there are very few countries that actually, we have the Pacific, the Atlantic, and the Arctic. So it's quite a unique in that respect. The government needs to look at programs to advance policy supporting the development of the blue economy. We need priorities for future investment. And that includes convening key nations interested in ocean restoration. And we can talk a little bit about what's already been done there. But ocean-based research and development and deployment of technologies, studying the impacts of things like tidal energy, for example, which is growing in its use around the world, it has impacts on the ocean ecosystem. We need to understand those. So I talked about Canada's leadership already. Through the G7 that was hosted in Halifax, but Canada was part of the Ocean Plastics Charter, which was championed by our country, but endorsed by the European Union and a number of European Union states. And there's more information that can be found out on the charter online by just doing a quick Ocean Plastics Charter search. Canada also contributed $100 million of funding towards ocean plastic in Asia Pacific. So the details of that funding are starting to emerge through the World Bank and other partners. So more to follow there. Next slide, Nora. So, as I mentioned, we had a series of speakers set the context, and these are sort of sample vignettes from those presentations that I think are useful. So, one of them was, and I'm trying to remember the author of this this particular bullet, who came from the investment community, but investors, the investor perspective was that governments and decision makers need to think longer term about the consequences of environmental crises, climate change, ocean plastics. They need to be able to tell a story about how money will make a difference, how it will impact. Investors are increasingly interested in having their money drive solutions while earning a competitive return. And for those of you that follow social impact investing, it is trillions of dollars worth of investment. So high wealth individuals, people like Richard Branson, as well as family trusts, where these monies are being invested, but they don't just want to make a return, they want to make a return while having an impact. And oceans are a likely source of future investment. So we talked about green bonds. Green bonds have been hugely successful. They're a financing vehicle among many, but there is now, I think, in the collective, maybe over 10 to 15 years, there's now over $1 trillion in green bonds are available. Most of those have been deployed towards on-land solutions. So reforestation, if I can use that example, planting a forest, would be a green bond style initiative. Now, it would be easy for you to say, well, wait a minute, what if we replant seagrass? And what if we replant kelp? Is that not green bond oriented? Yes, it could be, but there's a lot of uncertainty about what those things look like. So it's more likely that we'll start to see the emergence of blue bonds, which are specifically dealing with investments in ocean and coastal projects. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Benefits realized from green bonds have really benefited from a number of things, including standard setting, which has been very important to help investors deal with uncertainty. That's one of their key challenges, is they want to understand where that money is going. So standardization, common language, mechanisms for ensuring and validating that those benefits are happening, those are all really important, and they all need to be done in the context of blue bonds for oceans and other investment vehicles. Next slide, Nora. We had some case studies that were presented on the Great Lakes. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with North American geography, the Great Lakes are one of the largest collections of surface fresh water in the world. And they border the Canada-US border from Lake Superior all the way through to Lake Ontario and then the St. Lawrence. So it's a massive freshwater resource, but it's had problems from industrial pollution over the decades. And Chris Hilkeen from Pollution Probe featured a series of case studies on cleanup efforts that were undertaken in the Great Lakes. And what his research showed was that the returns on these investments were often 10 to 12-fold over the initial investment. So what do we take away from that? Well, coastal areas, whether it's lake coast or river coastline or ocean coastline, is highly valued property. And anything that we do to clean it up and restore it will likely result in higher economic returns. So I'll leave it at that, but the case studies were based on Great Lakes cleanup. A key challenge of financing in the blue economy is that most of the ocean is international waters. We already talked about that, as well as a lot of the ocean is unseen by the public. It happens below the surface, which makes it somewhat mysterious and somewhat uncertain for the investment community. It's poorly studied. We don't have a lot of data. And particularly in Asia Pacific, it's critical to forming priorities. So there are new innovations in technology like open ocean robotics, autonomous vehicles that can go out and collect data without having to have a research vessel that's costs millions of dollars to keep in service. We can use autonomous vehicles on the ocean to collect that information. The spectrum of activities in blue economy is very broad, and we've talked a little bit about everything from tourism to fishing. That there are a lot of services that are provided, and it's complicated, and so that means that we got a lot of ground to cover. 70% of the world is covered in water, so it's a much bigger problem than the land-based solutions that we've been focused on. And we're going to need a lot of different financing tools in order to get at that, blue bonds being one of them. Lastly, there's an increasing awareness about the vulnerability of our oceans. This is a really important issue. It came up over and over again, both in the domestic and in the international groups, was that we have an increasing awareness. The public is becoming aware of the challenges the oceans are facing, and they care about it. And therefore, we can use that broadening understanding to increase knowledge not only on plastics, but other challenges the oceans are facing. And this can be used to drive more support for investment in blue economy activities. Next slide, Nora. So I'll just go through this quickly and we can get to the big findings. I pulled these, this is like a force field analysis. It's a pros and cons table, if you will. The negative being the cons, the positive being the pros. These were issues that showed up in both the domestic group and the international group. That's how they got on the list. So we'll take the cons first, the bad news first. Access to capital is a problem. We need scale. We're going to need billions of dollars in order to solve the problem of ocean plastics. We need access to capital, which we may not have currently. We need leadership and collaboration. We need countries working together, and we need a much more collaborative format. There is jurisdictional confusion where the overlap of boundaries between countries, between provinces and other jurisdictions create governance issues. And we need data to be able to drive priorities, data we don't have currently. We have a limited knowledge of the negative economic impacts, and we're going to circle back to that at the end of the presentation. And we need better definitions and standardization within the blue economy to allow this knowledge and these priorities to be set. On the positive side, leadership and collaboration. As you'll often see in a force field analysis, it's both a negative and a positive. We're seeing the pact that's been formed. We're seeing countries stepping up. So there is leadership, there is collaboration happening, but we need more. There's often synergistic benefits that exist. So let me talk about habitat restoration. So saltwater marshes along coastlines, mangroves. These are places that not only restore the services the ocean provides, but often then can increase the amount of carbon that could be sequestered into those spaces. Well, that sequestered carbon has a monetary value. So if we can place more attention on the economic benefits of these positives, we can help fund some of these projects and some of these initiatives. So there's an opportunity to use these new financial instruments, as we talked about. We've got increased stakeholder engagement and education, which we also talked about, and the opportunity to understand positive economic impacts of improvement. And this will be something that we'll end the presentation with in terms of the APEC report. I don't want to get into that right now, but there are often associated with the negative impacts associated with pollution, for example, but then there are the jobs that are created to try to solve the problem, which have positive economic impacts in the form of jobs and value creation. And blue carbon projects, which we already mentioned, which is the sequestration of carbon in important shoreline areas and in deep water as well. Growth of ocean technology accelerators, and I'll talk a little bit about that in the next slide. So next slide, please, Mark. So I thought I'd share the international group that John was part of was pretty active. I mean, they produced a lot of information, which was great. One of the things they took the time to do was actually craft a list of priorities. And I think it's not hard for you, through the dive community, through the tourism community, to actually look at some of these and start to think about where jobs and economic value might lie. So sustainable ocean aquaculture, there's a lot happening in salmon fishing, salmon aquaculture, shrimp aquaculture. There's a lot of effort to clean that up. we're starting to see the increase in the number of summits that are focused on blue economy. Nairobi, Lisbon, Canada sponsored one in Kenya. So there's been an increase in the amount of conversation that's happening. Decarbonization of ocean shipping. So this is marine freight. They're moving away from diesel, bunker C, high carbon, high particulate emitting transportation fuels. And there's a real changeover that's happening there in that industry. Monitoring oceans, monitoring pollution and trash. You can see where this would be really important in terms of the dive community as a source of data. CO2 capture, I've already mentioned in terms of blue carbons. These are wetlands, eelgrass, kelp restoration. Leveraging the connectedness of tourism and plastics. And that means recognizing the economic impacts that will happen on tourism if this problem continues to persist. Ocean tidal energy, that's on the rise. That includes things like wave energy and tidal energy. Coastal infrastructure, which is going to be the source of trillions of dollars on rising ocean levels. There's going to be major investments that are going to have to be made worldwide. And then lastly, technological investments. And of course, last but not least, education, which is going to be key. Education came up multiple times over the course of the 3-hour discussion. And I think that would be, if John Aikman were here, he was one of our moderators. John's an interesting guy, former head of the City Bank in New York. So a major financier, now turned entrepreneur. He's got a fintech company that he's doing very well with. So very interesting guy. He was surprisingly one of the people that emphasized the education numerous times over the course of the discussion. Nora, next slide, please. So we're into the meat of the order, the key findings for Asia Pacific. Now, what we did was we had our 2 breakouts, and then we brought them together to share what their findings were. And the next 2 slides are based on the overlap between that conversation and the debrief that we did. I've taken a little bit of presenter's license here and tried to coach them a little bit relative to Asia Pacific, but I think we're pretty true to the findings from the session. By the way, the session findings will be available in the next couple of weeks in a report, and Nora and ADEX will be sharing that as a resource for you along with this PowerPoint if there's more interest in follow-up. So number 1 on the list, as I mentioned, the need for education. This is the education of the public. Again, leveraging that interest and concern for oceans, but also government and the investment community. The investment community will not flow money from the private sector into the oceans if there's a lot of uncertainty. If there's a lack of knowledge about how uncertainty might affect those investments, the money will not flow. So we need to begin that education if capital is to flow to ocean priorities. And the blue economy, I think, has a major role to play in that. There was a consistent message on the need to leverage public attention, so I've already sort of talked about that. Concerns over plastics, and I'll share just a little bit of a North American perspective for you. In Canada and the US, for example, and in Mexico to the same extent, we don't see a major issue with plastics on our shorelines. Yes, there is pollution, but not to the extent that it is in Asia Pacific. But despite that, the crisis level in Asia Pacific is well known to the public in North America, and they want action taken on. So again, this is an issue that's transcending geography in a sense that people recognize that this is a big problem and we need to do something about it. We're early in the discussion on blue economy, and I think everybody recognizes that this is an important conversation. And the group supported the idea of a forum, some sort of forum where this information and this dialogue could continue to happen post-Globe. Now, Globe is considering that because, of course, there's some valuable reference points that we can offer up. We've got a network of people who are very advanced in this area and thinking. but we've got to figure out how this forum would work and how we can link to ADEX and to Underwater 360 to be able to make that happen. As I mentioned, Minister McKenna's view was this is collaboration across the Pacific. I think electronically we need to figure out how does that forum work to be able to share information across what is a 15-hour plane ride. It's a massive, the largest single body of water in the world. How do we figure out how to share information? Next slide, Nora. I know I'm getting down to my last 5 minutes here, so I'm coming pretty close to the end. There is a need to facilitate priority setting. As I said, the ocean's problems are vast. Overfishing, habitat destruction, pollution, nutrient management, coastal kill zones in the ocean from agriculture. These are big problems. But if we're going to invest in a way that's going to have the biggest impact, we need data. And we need to be able to figure out those priorities. There are several centers in North America. So among the really good news that came out of the conversations and some of the additional research, there are several centers in North America and globally where research and investment in oceans is starting. Catapult is probably one of the most famous. I think it's based in Oslo. I may be corrected on that. Closer to home in Singapore, Circulate Capital, which just launched its Circulate Capital Ocean Fund, I think in December. Probably somebody in Singapore is going to correct me if I got that wrong, but a major fund. And what's unique about Circulate Capital is that fund is dedicated specifically to plastics. So it makes it unique. Catapult also has a plastics initiative, and many of the other investment forums do, but Circulate Capital is dedicated specifically to plastics and only plastics. Maritime Blue is one of the newest ocean accelerators. It's based in Washington State. And they're very interested in hosting this North America-based event that I'm going to talk about in a second. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the Marine Supercluster in Atlantic Canada. That's not so much on the investment of technologies, it's more in the ideation stage, where they're encouraging the creation of new types of technologies to enhance ocean health and ocean capital. And that's just in the early stages of forming. So what the group told us was that we should consider hosting a North American event to bring those global accelerators together and talk about research and investment and financing interests in oceans. And so Globe, again, we're going to need to look for partners to try to pull that off. Certainly, Seattle, Washington would be a really interesting place to do that because of all the activity that's happening on the west coast of North America. But more information will be shared as that moves forward. Next slide, please, Nora. So second last slide here. So a conference of the parties, so some of you may not be familiar with that. That is the annual gathering of governments that are working on climate change. They've been meeting for 25 years, so that may sound somewhat depressing. But COP's older than my children, so we know that they've got a lot of work ahead of them. But what was interesting about COP25 in Lisbon was it was the first time blue economy was featured in that dialogue. And it was supposed to be revisited in Glasgow in COP26. Now, Glasgow's been postponed, potentially canceled because of the pandemic. But we're part of a group that's looking at seeing whether we can bring that conversation forward virtually to continue it, because it got a first start in Lisbon, and we want to make sure that momentum is carried forward. There was and they strongly recommended, the group strongly recommended Globe to pursue that information and bring it forward through the portal, through our channels, and to get involved in the event, which we are doing. The recommendation to create a Blue Bonds working group. This was probably one of the most interesting recommendations that came out. I mentioned we had a lot of financiers that were part of that session, including Pyfera, which is one of Canada's most successful clean tech investment forums. That group led largely by John Aikman's interest, wants to see whether it's possible to create an ocean investment group in Canada. So the idea would need a sponsor. We need commitment from others. But the idea was that we could launch it at Globe Capital in 2021, which is our next major event. So really interesting outcome. Canada doesn't currently have an ocean accelerator, and the financial folks in the group were really positioning for that to happen. And lastly, on the earliness of this conversation, I think blue economy is starting out, as I've already said numerous times, but the negative economic impacts associated with reduced ocean services is substantive. It's in the trillions of dollars, and I'll give you a reference for that in a second. But there are also substantive positive economic benefits associated with addressing issues like ocean plastics. So we know there's opportunity here. Therefore, I could not help but conclude that blue economy would be a useful framework, not only for North America, but for Asia Pacific, and in terms of what ADEX is trying to do within the dive community, but also more broadly within the governments, the economic sectors of interest in Asia Pacific. So last slide, please, Nora. So I said I'd give you a reference for those economic impacts. What we're planning, John and Nora and the folks at ADEX are planning for a session in the next few weeks, is to do a session that will feature the blue economy through the lens of the APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, relaunched a report from 2009. They refreshed it using 2018-2019 interviews and data on the costs of marine debris. Now, marine debris is broader than plastics, but recognizing that plastics make up about 80% of ocean debris, this is a major report that we think would be really helpful to not only position blue economy, both negative impacts and positive impacts, but really for the marine tourism industry and for the dive industry writ large. This will be a really important report. And that's the URL for the report. You can jump online and have a look at that report in advance of the session that ADEX is planning. And the date and time for the APEC report presentation is just being confirmed. So we'll be back to you with more information. But we really feel that the economic impacts are the important place to position ocean plastics in Asia Pacific. And we hope that you'll agree by sitting in on this next session that Nora and team are planning. So that concludes my slides, Nora. If you want to just put up the last slide while we're answering questions, hopefully, that come from the audience.
Thank you, Bruce. Back to Bruce. Bruce, we do have a couple of questions. So the first one would be from Ms. Monica Chin. She's the founder for ADREC, which is a Arad Dinawan Research Education Center in Sabah, Malaysia. So she asked, Mr. Bruce, what is the requirement to collaborate on seagrass and mangrove conservation and restoration? And she also mentioned we need more international support to truly understand the importance of seagrass and mangrove. Due to MCO, all our project is postponed to 2021, but we do still monitor our current planted restored seagrass. Mr. Bruce, what is the requirement to have this collaboration done?
So I think the best way to answer that, Nora, is to tell a story. I was down in California at a carbon advancement initiative that California hosts every year. And I was sitting with a gentleman from Massachusetts. Massachusetts has some major ocean research initiatives like Woods Hole is one of the institutes down in Boston. He had an idea for a kelp replanting technology. So it's a bed seeding technology that allows the seeds to be germinated at the surface, and then when they have been, the technology lowers down to the seabed and essentially seeds those kelp. Now, like seagrass, kelp has a lot of beneficial properties that it imparts to the ocean. It enhances oxygenation, it cools the local area by protecting the seabed from sunlight, it increases the biodiversity by increasing the habitat for local species. So we have all of these beneficial, all these benefits that get created by this activity. But what he was talking to me about was the struggle that he was having at getting on anyone's agenda for funding, whether that was government funding or whether it was private sector capital. So I think the way I would answer the question is the collaboration is, as always, based on partnerships. But I think what we understood through the blue economy was there are some standardizations, some knowledge to reduce the uncertainty associated with ocean investment that are really important to see that capital flow. And the reason why governments play a role in that, in the standard setting, we all play a role in the education, we all play a role in the collaboration. But I think it's very necessary to collect that data and information and standardization, because government funding alone is not going to create the scale that we need. And I remember when I was in ADEX in 2019, I'm trying to remember, I think it was PADI as an organization was working on some seagrass replanting. And one of the problems was there was no large scale operations. These were quite small, and it needed a lot of infusion of capital to try to create that scale where you're having much larger impacts over much shorter periods of time. And to do that, we need capital. And to get access to that capital, we need to educate, we need to collect data, and we need to understand the uncertainties that need to be addressed in order to allow that money to flow and those collaborations to flourish.
Thank you, Bruce. We do have another question. So this question goes something like, if I am working in the tourism industry, why should I care about the blue economy?
Okay. So I think you should care because there is a framework that's been created to try to understand the actual impact on your ability to generate a livelihood through ocean services. So if for example, I'm in the dive tourism industry, and what I'm seeing is a drop in the number of tours that I'm giving because people don't want to swim amongst a sea of plastic, right? If plastic pollution is having a visible impact on the environment where I make my living, I should be interested in knowing about that and knowing about how I can argue and position for cleanup. In other words, become part of that advocacy voice to get government's attention. I think I used the term people, profit, planet. It's similar to the three legs of the sustainability stool, economic, social, and environmental. And I've been in this business for 25 years, and we've always known that it's the economic that gets a lot of the attention. Money matters, and if without it, people pay less attention to the social and environmental impacts. So by understanding the cost of the impact of whether it's pollution or whether it's loss of diversity or whether it's loss of habitat or overfishing, regardless of the ocean issue, if you understand the economic impacts, that is one of the ways that you can engage governments in a meaningful way. If tourism is of significant importance, and I don't want to steal Professor McGilgram's thunder from his presentation in June, but let me tell you, the impacts in 2018 and 2019 from the refresh of the APEC study, I think are eightfold over what they were back in 2009. So this problem is huge, and tourism is one of the places that it's going to impact, is already impacting, and that impact is getting worse over time. So if I work in the tourism industry, I need to know about those economic impacts, and I need to be a part of the conversation that looks to address them.
Thanks, Bruce. We do have another question from Jim Standing, from the CEO of The Fourth Element. He asked, what is the role of organizations like the Plastic Bank and also manufacturers in engaging in the ocean plastic debate?
Well, the Ocean Bank is another example of a tool, a mechanism, a policy, or a more program, I think, that's looking at putting a value on plastic waste. In other words, trying to create the conditions, the economic conditions, to not only collect it, but then to convert it into something of value. So we haven't touched at all through the presentation on circular economy, but circular economy is certainly another area where people are interested in taking that plastic waste, ideally before it even gets into the ocean, to actually convert it into something of value, whether it's new materials to make more plastic, or whether it's conversion into things like weather-resistant benching. In other words, plastic wood products to be used, in all sorts of different applications. So you're trying to figure out how to convert that waste into something of value. To do that, you need technologies, you need markets, you need demand, you need to put a price on those plastic products that covers the cost, and you need things like the Plastic Bank to be able to be, attempting to place monetary value on these wastes that are going to help create the market. And there are many others. I think the Circulate Capital Ocean Fund is another good example. And these things are going to be necessary, and we're going to need these different tools, but we need scale. What we recognize is that we're definitely making an impact, but it's relatively small given the scale of the problem that we have with plastics. And we need to be able to, perhaps through collaboration, perhaps through larger investments from the international community, but we need to create scale to solve this. And recognizing we have two problems. We have to stem the flow of plastics into the ocean. So we've got to stop the pollution at its source. And then we've got to clean up what already exists. We can't just leave that waste to break down into microplastics, which we're still unsure of what the health consequences for marine life and for humans that consume ocean protein is. So we've got to not only solve the problem of the source of the plastic, we have to do the cleanup. And that's going to be expensive, and we're going to need public and private sector money to do it.
So, Bruce, when you mentioned about scalability factor with regards to ocean funding, there's in terms of the resources available for applying for such funds, may it be from the World Bank Blue Bonds, or someone from IFC, or even Circulate Capital Ocean Funds. What could a small NGO, or even a non-profit organization, or even a social enterprise do to be able to qualify for such grants?
Yeah. Well, I think every financial institution, including the World Bank, that provides funding, and the World Bank is actually one of the institutions that's dispensing part of the $100 million that Canada dedicated to cleaning up plastics in Asia Pacific. And we also should mention there is the think it's $1.5 billion that exists within the Alliance to End Plastic Waste, which is also based in Singapore. So we know there is money flowing into the problem. I think what my advice to the ENGO community in Asia Pacific is to think scale. And one of the previous questions was getting at, what's that collaboration look like? I would look to try to create scale. That is much larger reductions. I mean, for example, ADEX, and I tip my hat to John and ADEX. I know John went out of his way to describe many of the activities on shoreline cleanup, for example, that were being undertaken by partners from the ADEX community. But when you look at the total amounts that have been collected over the last 4 or 5 years, they're relatively modest compared to the volume that's going into the ocean. So we've got to think scale. And I think scale is possible through communities and through leadership that could come from the nonprofit organizations, the non-governmental organizations. So that's, to my mind, I know I'm just sort of going over that same issue of scale over and over again, but I think it's really important to help us figure out how we can rise to the size of the challenge that we're dealing with.
One more question, Bruce. This question is by Ms. Celine Tan from Singapore. She asked, I understand that based on your presentation, most of the case study is presented from the North America region.
Right.
In Asia being having a lot of rivers contributing a lot of plastic, ocean plastic pollution into the ocean, perhaps could I also have your opinion on what is synergistic possibilities they are in the Asian market?
That's a great question. Gosh, it's a question that probably we could spend another 60 minutes on if we had the time. I think she's correct in the assertion that the blue economy breakouts, well, at least one of the breakouts focused on domestic case studies. Case studies are, I think, really important because they shine a light on the positive. It's easy to get lost in the negative, and those of us that have been living through the pandemics are all too well aware of how the negative seems to rule the day. But there are positive things that are happening. There are sources of collaboration, sources of technology, such as river damming, that are actually working. So case studies, I think, would be one of the things that I would suggest. The other is the circular economy angle, because the part of the problem with waste and pollution is that if it has no value, it ends up in places like the ocean. When you place a value on something, people are far more likely to collect it. They're far more likely to process it and convert it into something to realize that monetary value. So communities become hugely important across all of the countries in the region. They are going to be ultimately the hands that help solve at least the source plastics issue. So I think thinking community and thinking scale and thinking about where that funding is best placed is going to be really helpful. Now, the other event that I think I would look to is, and I know some of the Nordic states like Finland, Norway, Sweden are already very engaged. I think Oslo is where Catapult is based out of. I know they're already very engaged in ocean investment. So if one looked at the World Circular Economy Forum coming up in 2021 and said, how big a feature is plastics in that conversation? How much time and effort is Oslo and the other countries in the Nordic states placing on the plastics issue in oceans? And can we do more to rally some of the European research and European investment in oceans to try to enhance and improve the outcomes in Asia Pacific? So I think there's a couple of places that I would look. One of them would be COP26. One of them would be the World Circular Economy Forum. But I think the Nordic states in the EU have resources, they have interest, and they're very good at the services they provide. That could be another place for collaboration that might be useful to Asia Pacific.
Thank you, Bruce. One more last question. What is the definition of a blue economy, basically, and what is the difference between blue economy and sustainable blue growth?
Oh gosh. Well, I'll tackle the first part first. So our definition of blue economy is essentially the services that oceans, seas, and waterways offer. So any activity that water is results in a benefit to us, to humans. So if you can drink fresh water, that is a service that water is providing. If your job is to harvest ocean protein, if you're a fisherman, that is an ocean service and therefore part of the blue economy. It is that broad range of services that oceans, seas, and waterways provide us that makes up the blue economy. Now that's separate from the activities within the blue economy that we need to focus on to ensure that those services are protected. So I'll give you an example, Nora. Saltwater marshes are incredibly important for flood prevention. They're an incredible source. Some of the most diverse, biodiverse regions in the world are salt marshes. Yet they're often the things that are plowed under in order to create, real estate development. So the minute a marsh is lost or a mangrove marsh is torn apart to make room for building, we lose the value of that service. The ocean is poorer because we can't then prevent floods. We lose biodiversity, which are often areas where species lay their eggs and before they return to the ocean. So we lose a lot when we lose those services. So the blue economy is saying there's a value to that service. We need to protect that value. We need to restore that value so that the ecosystem as a whole is healthier as a result. Now, there's a conflict because that land that we talked about as being incredibly valuable because it's on the ocean is in conflict with those ocean services that are provided. And that's part of the debate that we need to overcome if we're going to solve some of these bigger ocean health issues.
Thank you so much, Bruce, for your time.
My pleasure, Nora. It's been a real pleasure. I hope people have found it useful. Stay tuned for the details of the date and time for the APEC report for Professor McGilgrim from Wollongong University in Australia. He was the lead author on the APEC revised report. So stay tuned for that and for more Ocean Partnership Summit announcements coming from Underwater 360 and Globe Series. Thank you again for your time.
Thanks, Bruce. Once again, I'd just like to remind everybody that the next session would be Spotlight on Ghost Nets. Let me just show you a little bit of the posters itself. Right, so coming right up in just a few more minutes is a close-up session on Spotlight on Ghost Nets, another ocean plastics conundrum that we would like to highlight. So we have panelists from Gary Stokes from Ocean Asia, Jonas Scholes from India, Heidi Yu and Harry Chan from Hong Kong, Anwar Abdullah from Malaysia, and also the founder for Ocean Quest Global, and Heidi Tate from Australia, which is the CEO for Tangaroa Blue in Australia. And this session will be moderated by Miss Elsie Gabriel from India. Do join us. Just stay a while longer and If you have any further questions in regards to this session with the unveiling of the Blue Economy by Bruce Dudley from the Delphi Group and also Globe Series, and also our partner in Ocean Partnership Summit Asia, which is coming up real soon, do drop us a line, and we are most happy to assist with all the questions that you have for us. Once again, thank you very much. Thanks, Bruce, and have a good day ahead in Canada.
Bye. Stay safe, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.